Hello, this is the second part of my two-part presentation in which I present the hypothesis that Atlantis could have been a below sea level basin that was already sunken before its destruction, instead of the commonly held hypothesis that Atlantis was above sea level before it was destroyed, it then sank below sea level following its destruction. Again, the hypothesis that I am presenting is that Atlantis was below sea level both before and after its destruction. What is this? This is right here. This is the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, and this is a giant hurricane that's in the Gulf of Mexico. As you can guess, this is Hurricane Katrina. And so, why am I showing you an image of Hurricane Katrina as it relates to Atlantis? It seems like I could have shown any example of a natural disaster. Why specifically Hurricane Katrina? And the answer as to why I picked Hurricane Katrina to show is that New Orleans, which was destroyed by Hurricane Katrina, is actually a very, very good example of that is a land in a city that is actually situated below sea level, yet is normally dry because it is protected from the ocean or the Gulf of Mexico, which is itself connected to the ocean, by a system of levees that prevents the water from naturally flowing under the influence of gravity into the low-lying portions of the city. But every once in a while, you have a situation where the levees actually break or the levees are overtopped. Then you have that below sea level area, that sunken land, actually just fill up all the way to the top and just completely submerge the city and its inhabitants. And so that's I feel like that's a very good analogy as to what I am proposing Atlantis was. I'm saying that Atlantis was just a New Orleans that on a vastly larger scale. Instead of the land of New Orleans, which is only around maybe a few 10 square miles in size, that's below sea level. Atlantis, I am supposing and I am hypothesizing, was a land that was hundreds of thousands of square miles in size, and that entire land area was below sea level. So, what are the advantages of proposing such a geographical configuration of Atlantis? It's just like the destruction of New Orleans. Lands lying below sea level, like New Orleans and much of the Netherlands, are prone to catastrophic flooding. And in fact, if the levee system that is built to prevent that flooding fails, then you have a flood in which gravity is ultimately working against you. It's not like a normal tsunami where the waters rise, but under the influence of gravity, the waters recede back to their equilibrium position. Here, in the example of New Orleans in the Netherlands, gravity is working against you, and that water is falling down upon the people who are living there. So it's a flood of a completely different kind and a potentially much more destructive flood. And we know that Atlantis was described as having been destroyed in a single day and night following an earthquake. The idea that I am proposing, in fact, is similar. Let's consider the analogy. Imagine that New Orleans was a very earthquake-prone region. Instead of New Orleans being a very hurricane-prone region, imagine it was a earthquake-prone region. Well, just as the storm surge and the rains that come from a hurricane can destroy and damage a levee, at the same time, an earthquake can cause a levee to collapse also. And if the cause of the levee's collapse had been an earthquake, then the waters would have just penetrated that area of collapse and had flowed into New Orleans and submerged the city, just in the same way as a hurricane. And since we know that Atlantis was actually destroyed, the causative factor of the submergence of Atlantis was said to be an earthquake. And so I am suggesting in a way that there is a deep analogy potentially between New Orleans and Atlantis if we suppose that Atlantis was a below sea level land just like New Orleans. And we already know that the possibility of large areas of land that are below sea level, not merely the few tens of square miles of New Orleans and the Netherlands, is also possible because we know that the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Seas were once dry basins that were only filled with a small amount of fresh water, but then they were converted and transformed into saltwater lakes when a flood that originated from the ocean poured down into the basin. And presumably, if there were any people living in those basins, they would have been destroyed in a single day and night, quite certainly. And so I'm arguing that Atlantis is a similar event to these types of floods in which a below sea level basin was flooded, and a vastly larger scale of something we have already seen in New Orleans when the levees collapse and the sunken city is actually just filled in with water from the ocean. But the problem with this assertion, of course, is that it wasn't necessarily, I didn't point to a specific passage in Plato's dialogues that would support this geographical configuration of Atlantis. And because this is a certain type of flood that occurs, we know that there are below sea level basins in this world. We know that they have been flooded, both in the present time and in the distant past and in the near past. But the question is, how does this actually link to Atlantis, and where is the evidence that suggests that Atlantis is an example of one of these below sea level basin type lands? There is evidence, but it doesn't say so directly, because the Egyptians in the time of Plato, or the Egyptians in the time of Solon, when the story was transmitted to Greece, they didn't have this kind of scientific terminology that we have. We have a precise definition of every scientific concept, for example, the atom, the chemical, the bond, the gravity, for example, and nuclear fusion, and DNA, mitosis, meiosis, cells, organelles. We have this precise scientific terminology for every concept that eliminates ambiguity and confusion when we're dealing with technical terms. But in the time of Egypt, although they were advanced for their time, they did not have this precise scientific terminology, or if they did, their terms might not necessarily be easily translated to our terms. But the idea is that nevertheless, the Egyptians could have been conveying what is actually a scientific term, just phrased in plain language. In other words, a scientific concept is being expressed potentially by these Egyptians in terms of colloquial language. And here, I am suggesting that the Egyptian priest is actually talking about the concept of a below sea level or an above sea level land. In speaking of water having a tendency to come up from below. Well, if you are living in a below sea level area, if you are living in an above sea level area, then water does naturally tend to come up from below if you're above sea level. But if you are below sea level, water comes down from above because of the natural influence of gravity. And of course, the Egyptians aren't going to specifically say the word gravity, and the translator who translated this text isn't going to use that word either. But I am arguing that you can use the description of what happens to water or another liquid to provide an alternate definition of the concept of sea level. That is, defining sea level and whether you're above or below it in terms of what happens to water, in other words. And so the Egyptian priest mentioned that the stream from heaven is what comes pouring down. And the stream from heaven, I am suggesting, is not just like a river flow. It's not just a flood that originates from rainfall or a river overflowing, but he is talking about the ocean coming down from above. An ocean penetrating a natural levee and pouring down into the basin below. And this is what I suggested in the previous slide. I already kind of hinted at it, that the Egyptian priest was trying to express the concept of sea level without using that word in particular. But that he defined sea level and whether you're above or below it in terms of the behavior of water and its tendency to flow either up or down. And here I kind of explicitly write down what I have been saying in words here. And so but the problem with that hypothesis, of course, is that the idea that the Egyptian was talking about sea level in that passage is that the Egyptian priest was telling Solon that ancient Greece and ancient Athens had been destroyed by these floods. Presumably, if we take the Egyptian priest's words to mean sea level, that would imply that the Athenians and the Greek people actually in the past are the ones who lived below sea level. But in this video, we're trying to learn about whether Atlantis was a below sea level basin, and we're trying to analyze and test that hypothesis. But at the same time, we know that both Atlantis and Athens were destroyed in the aftermath of earthquakes in like manner. So what I supposed was that if Atlantis and Athens were destroyed in a common manner, that destruction, that there is an underlying common geography and a geology that accounts for that common mode of destruction. So if we presume that Athens was below sea level, we can also infer that Atlantis was also below sea level. But we could actually go even further. We could actually go even further because there is direct textual evidence to support the hypothesis that Atlantis could have been a below sea level land even before its destruction. Just like a very large example of New Orleans, or like the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea basins before they were flooded. And we have that this area around the city was a level plain which was surrounded by mountains which descended toward the sea. In other words, the city of Atlantis was somewhere here. You had a level plain, and then it was surrounded by mountains which descended to the sea. This is the ocean right here. It was surrounded by mountains which descended to the sea. This is the ocean. And so that kind of configuration is actually consistent with the plain of Atlantis and the city of Atlantis actually being below sea level. Let's say it's around 6,000 feet below sea level. Now here, Plato doesn't directly tell us that Atlantis is below sea level. He doesn't use that terminology. But the idea is that given the facts of the geography that are described by Plato, it is very much possible for Atlantis to have been a below sea level basin. So that, for example, let's say that this part collapsed here due to an earthquake. Let's say it collapsed, then it fell apart right here. In that case, the ocean would begin to pour into the basin here through these channels that have been opened up, and it would be flooded. And this whole area would just become submerged in water. And in fact, if, as I was saying before, if this part was below sea level, even before its destruction, its ultimate disappearance underwater becomes easy to explain because water is naturally tending to flow down under the influence of gravity. And so this is going to be a flood of an entirely different character than, for example, a tsunami, which is forced to rise and then is naturally going to be receding and having a tendency to recede back into the oceans under the influence of gravity. And another advantage of these types of floods is that while they are rare events, they are still known geological phenomena and do not require new geological theories to be invented in order to explain them. And also, an earthquake could be a trigger for such a flood, as was stated by Plato's Atlantis. And I showed you in this drawing how an earthquake could have caused such a flood. To conclude, Atlantis could have been a below sea level basin, and if it were, explaining its destruction would be much easier. In fact, it would be almost trivial. It would be extremely easy. And independent textual evidence backs up the possibility of Atlantis being below sea level. And it is reasonable to interpret the Egyptian priests' mentioning of the tendency of water to rise and fall as referring to the ocean water specifically, in that the priest was trying to convey the concept of lands that were below or above sea level without using scientific terminology. Again, this doesn't prove that Atlantis was below a sea level basin, but it's a sensible hypothesis with a lot of evidence supporting it. And it helps us to narrow down the proposed locations of Atlantis to a short list. And we can then individually test that short list of Atlantis hypotheses and quickly get a sense of whether those hypotheses could possibly be candidates for Atlantis. In other words, this specific hypothesis of Atlantis having been a below sea level basin is a testable and a sensible hypothesis.